Some medieval deaths are so bizarre that they still make us wonder centuries later. Sudden accidents, strange circumstances, and eerie final moments turned extraordinary lives into disturbing endings that give us pause. Join us as we uncover the baffling details of the 5 most bizarre deaths of the Middle Ages. He was a man who had risen from modest beginnings in London to become one of the most powerful figures in the English Church. But on December 29, 1170, Thomas Becket's long conflict with royal authority reached its violent end inside Canterbury Cathedral, shocking an entire continent and helping create the intriguing image of a martyr. Thomas had been born around 1119 or 1120 in London, the son of Gilbert and Matilda Becket, both of Norman descent. His father, once a merchant, later became a property owner and even served as sheriff of the city. Thomas received an education, spent time in Paris, and worked as a clerk after his family faced financial difficulties. His life changed when he entered the household of Archbishop Theobald of Bec, who trusted him with important missions to Rome and later recommended him to King Henry II. When the king took a liking to him, Thomas became Lord Chancellor in 1155, managing royal revenues and serving closely alongside Henry, forming a friendship so strong that people said the two men shared one heart and one mind. But his appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162 transformed Thomas Becket. After his ordination and consecration, Thomas became devoted to defending the rights and independence of the church, which brought him into direct conflict with Henry and the royals. Their relationship collapsed as Thomas insisted that churchmen could only be judged by ecclesiastical courts, while Henry demanded that clergy be subject to royal justice like other free men. Tensions escalated through the constitutions of Clarendon in 1164, Thomas's exile, and his threats of excommunication. Although he eventually returned to Canterbury in 1170 after a compromise, his severe temperament remained unchanged. On Christmas Day that year, he excommunicated several bishops, provoking Henry's anger and leading the king to utter the words that would seal Thomas's fate. "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" Although the words were not accompanied by any direct order to harm the archbishop, they were interpreted by some as a desire to see Thomas removed. 4 knights, Reginald Fitzurse, Hugh de Morville, William de Tracy, and Richard le Breton, took these words as an instruction to act. They traveled to Canterbury on December 29, 1170, intending to force the archbishop to submit to the king's authority. They first confronted Thomas in his residence, demanding that he withdraw his actions, but he refused. As evening vespers began, Thomas walked toward the cathedral, ignoring attempts by others to secure the doors. The knights entered with hidden armor and retrieved their weapons after he refused to accompany them to Winchester. Inside the cathedral, where monks were preparing for the service, Thomas took his position near the entrance to the cloister and made no attempt to flee. The knights advanced with their weapons ready. Fitzurse delivered the first strike, grazing Thomas's tonsured head. A cleric named Grimm tried to shield him but was injured in the attempt. More blows came as Thomas held onto a pillar, and one final devastating strike ended the struggle. One of the attackers ensured there was no doubt about the outcome before stepping back. The assault was swift and decisive, and Thomas fell where he stood. The aftermath was swift and far-reaching. Monks prepared his body for burial and found that he had worn a hair shirt beneath his robes, meaning he was indeed a God-fearing man who took drastic measures to repent. Reports of miracles at his tomb spread quickly, and within little more than 2 years, Pope Alexander III declared him a saint. His shrine in Canterbury became one of Europe's most significant pilgrimage sites, and Londoners considered him one of the city's patron saints. Although his shrine was destroyed during the Reformation in 1540, the place of his death remains marked today. Thomas Becket's killing endures as a defining moment of medieval history, remembered for its brutality, its political consequences, and its extraordinary impact on faith across Europe. Al-Mustasim entered February 1258, carrying a title that had survived 5 centuries of history, yet he faced a threat unlike any the Abbasid Caliphate had ever seen. As an Abbasid caliph ruling from Baghdad, he lived through a moment when the world he knew was collapsing around him, and the dramatic tension of his final days would lead to one of the most bizarre deaths of the Middle Ages. Born in 1213 as Abu Ahmad Abdallah ibn al-Mustansir Billah, he was the son of Caliph al-Mustansir and his wife Hajir, and he rose to the throne in late 1242. His reign placed him at the center of major political struggles across the Middle East. He opposed the rise of Shajar al-Dur in Egypt, and although he claimed the authority to legitimize rulers, he soon became entangled in conflicts involving Mamluks, Ayyubids, and shifting alliances across Syria and Palestine. His refusal to recognize Shajar al-Dur as sultan created upheaval, and while he worked to mediate between rival powers, he increasingly faced an even greater danger: the advance of Hulagu Khan's Mongol forces, who had already destroyed resistance in Transoxiana and Khorasan and demanded submission from Baghdad. Despite receiving Hulagu's warnings, Al-Mustasim underestimated the threat. Influenced by his ineffectual advisor and Grand Vizier, Ibn al-Alqami, he believed that if the capital were in danger, armies from across the Islamic world would rush to defend it. In his naivety, he failed to summon his full forces, strengthen Baghdad's defenses, or call on distant sultanates for help. His taunting replies to Hulagu only increased Mongol anger, and they finally broke off negotiations. By early January 1258, Mongol columns surrounded Baghdad from both sides of the Tigris River, forming a massive siege. On January 29th, the Mongols began their assault, building a palisade and ditch around the city and employing siege engines and catapults to weaken the walls. Al-Mustasim sent out 20,000 cavalry to attack them, but the fierce Mongols destroyed the force after breaching dikes along the river and flooding the ground behind the Abbasid troops. Although the Caliph technically had tens of thousands of soldiers available, they had been assembled hastily, were poorly equipped, and lacked discipline, making it impossible to withstand the organized Mongol attack. By February 5th, the enemy had seized key sections of the walls. Attempts to negotiate failed, and around 3,000 notables who tried to approach Hulagu were murdered. On February 10th, Baghdad surrendered. 3 days later, the Mongols entered and began a week-long destruction. Contemporary accounts described mosques, palaces, libraries, and hospitals being looted, burned, or torn apart. Priceless books from the city's 36 public libraries were ripped up, their leather covers used as sandals. The House of Wisdom, the Great Library of Baghdad, was destroyed. Citizens who attempted to escape were intercepted and killed, and the scale of the massacre was so vast that the stench forced Hulagu to move his camp upwind. Al-Mustasim was captured and forced to witness the devastation of his capital, the deaths of scholars and nobles, and the plundering of his treasury. Historical accounts agree that he was executed soon afterward in a bizarre manner. The Mongols feared executing him and his family in the regular way due to a superstition that spilling royal blood would bring misfortune upon them. Instead, they wrapped him tightly in a rug or carpet, immobilizing him, and then trampled him beneath the hooves of their horses until he died. Reports state the process lasted around 15 minutes. Most of his sons were killed as well. One surviving son was taken to Mongolia, where he lived in captivity and had descendants, but played no further role in Islamic affairs. Al-Mustasim was the last Abbasid caliph ruling from Baghdad. His death marked the end of the Abbasid Caliphate as a real political force and left the Muslim world without a caliph for the first time in its history. Baghdad became a ruined and depopulated city for decades, and although it later recovered under new rulers, the fall of 1258 remained a defining catastrophe. Al-Mustasim's final moments, ending in the rug and trampling execution, stand among the most disturbing and bizarre royal deaths recorded in medieval history. Born into a world where succession was uncertain and the stakes were immense, Arthur I, Duke of Brittany, lived a short life shaped by power, ambition, and dangerous political alliances. His young age and the mystery surrounding the tragic fate that befell him made Arthur a figure whose disappearance would stain a king's legacy and leave centuries of unanswered questions. Born in 1187, Arthur came into the world without a father to protect him and his titles. His father, Geoffrey II, Duke of Brittany, died before Arthur was born. His mother was Duchess Constance. As the only legitimate grandson of Henry II in the male line after Geoffrey's death, the infant immediately became central to the unresolved tensions surrounding succession. His early childhood unfolded in an unstable political landscape shaped by rivalries among Henry II's surviving sons, Richard, who became king after their father, and John, who remained a source of suspicion, mistrust, and conflict. Arthur's name carried enormous symbolic weight in Brittany, and Constance emphasized his Breton identity, even sending him to be raised in the French royal household under King Philip II, who recognized the political advantage of supporting a young claimant. During Richard's reign, Arthur was once named heir presumptive, but as Richard lay dying in 1199, he designated John as his successor, believing Arthur too young to secure the throne. Yet the matter was far from settled. Many nobles in Anjou and Maine supported Arthur instead, and Philip II also backed his claim. Although temporary agreements and shifting alliances shaped the following years, Arthur remained a potent rival to John's authority across the Angevin Empire. Arthur's fate changed decisively in 1202, when he was only 15 years old. Supported again by Philip II, he launched a campaign against John. That summer, he besieged his grandmother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, at Mirbeau, attempting to force John's hand. Instead, John responded with remarkable speed, surprising Arthur's forces and capturing him on August 1st, 1202. The 15-year-old duke was taken first to Château de Falaise, placed under the guard of Hubert de Burgh. According to chronicler Ralph of Coggeshall, John ordered Arthur to be blinded and castrated, but Hubert refused to carry out the command. Fearing John's anger, Hubert spread a false story that Arthur had died of natural causes, a claim that immediately outraged the Bretons, who suspected far worse. In 1203, Arthur was moved to Rouen under the supervision of William de Braos, a powerful marcher lord whose fortunes later rose sharply under John, contributing to later suspicions about his role. Nothing certain is recorded of Arthur after this transfer. His disappearance in 1203 became one of the most troubling mysteries of medieval Europe. Several accounts circulated among chroniclers. One widely repeated version claimed that Arthur's guards refused to harm him, leaving John to commit the killing himself. According to this tradition, the king ended Arthur's life during a drunken outburst and disposed of the body in the Seine. The most vivid description appears in the Margam Annals. This narrative states that on the Thursday before Easter, after dinner, John, described as drunk and possessed by the devil, killed Arthur with his own hands, tied a heavy stone to the body, and cast it into the river. A fisherman was said to have later discovered the corpse and arranged a secret burial at a priory, fearing retribution if the truth became known. Other stories implicated William de Braos himself. His wife later openly accused John of being responsible for the death, doing so just before their own conflict with the king, which added further layers of suspicion. The aftermath of Arthur's disappearance reshaped political dynamics across England and France. No one, neither Philip II nor the Bretons, received official confirmation of Arthur's fate. In Brittany, his vanishing created a complex succession crisis, eventually resolved by naming his half-sister Alix as Duchess. Meanwhile, Eleanor, Arthur's sister, remained imprisoned for life, ensuring she could never claim power. King John's reputation never recovered from the widespread belief that he had ordered, or personally committed, the killing. The uncertainty surrounding Arthur's final hours and the shocking nature of the allegations made this case one of the most bizarre and unsettling deaths of the Middle Ages, remembered for its brutality, secrecy, and the devastating political consequences it left behind. Edward II's life moved through years of privilege, conflict, favoritism, and political upheaval, and the final stage of his story remains one of the most debated mysteries of the Middle Ages. His fall unfolded slowly, shaped by personal attachments, repeated conflicts with powerful nobles, and a deep political fracture that left England divided and increasingly unstable. Born on April 25, 1284, as the fourth son of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile, Edward became heir after his elder brother's death and succeeded his father in 1307. He soon abandoned his father's military campaigns and transferred authority to his favorite, Piers Gaveston, who received lands, titles, and unrestricted influence. This relationship, whose exact nature is still unknown, caused immediate resentment among major nobles. Gaveston was repeatedly exiled and eventually captured and executed by a group of earls in 1312. Edward's anger over Gaveston's death marked a turning point in his reign, intensifying his hostility toward certain magnates and further weakening the fragile balance between king and nobility. The king later elevated the Despencer family, granting them significant lands and authority. Their rapid rise created widespread hostility and helped spark the Despencer War, a conflict that deepened the political fracture across the realm. Queen Isabella, Edward's wife, became increasingly alienated by the dominance of the Despensers. Sent to France in 1325 to negotiate peace, she remained abroad, gathering support from exiles and forming a powerful alliance with Roger Mortimer. Their eventual invasion forced Edward to flee, and his last loyal supporters collapsed in the face of superior opposition. Captured and forced to abdicate in favor of his son Edward III, the former king was placed under the guard of men who had every political incentive to prevent his return. He was moved from place to place to avoid rescue attempts and held under increasingly tight control. Edward's death in 1327 remains shrouded in uncertainty. Contemporary chronicles offered differing accounts, but the version that dominated popular belief described a method intended to leave no external marks. According to this account, the king was strapped to a table with heavy chains. Multiple weights were placed across his torso, crushing him downward. A large horn was then inserted into his body, creating a passage that ensured no flames or instruments burned visible flesh. A red-hot iron was pushed through the horn and forced into his body. This method was believed to cause catastrophic internal injury without producing outward signs, allowing officials to claim that Edward had died of natural causes. Whether this description reflects the exact circumstances or emerged from heightened rumor, it remains one of the most shocking alleged forms of execution associated with a medieval monarch. The political consequences of Edward's death were immediate. Isabella and Mortimer continued to rule in the name of the young Edward III, but their legitimacy was weakened weakened by widespread belief that the former king had been killed. Many nobles viewed the manner of his alleged death as proof of their tyranny, and the rumor damaged their support among both the aristocracy and the wider population. When Edward III eventually seized power, he had Mortimer executed and placed his mother under house arrest, distancing himself from the events surrounding his father's final days. Although historians continue to debate the exact details of Edward II's death, the combination of political rivalry, imprisonment, and extraordinary rumor secured his place among the most disturbing deaths of the Middle Ages. Richard I, known across Europe as Richard the Lionheart, lived a life defined by war, political struggle, and extraordinary personal reputation. Yet his final days unfolded not on a distant battlefield, but at a small and seemingly insignificant castle in France. It was one of the most bizarre events of the Middle Ages, a sudden collapse of a warrior king who had survived crusades, rebellions, captivity, and years of conflict, only to end in a baffling manner. Richard was born on September 8, 1157, the third of 5 sons of Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Although not expected to inherit the throne, the early deaths of his older brothers placed him next in line. From a young age, Richard showed military talent and force of will. By 16, he commanded his own army in Poitou, putting down rebellions against his father. Over time, he became known as a formidable commander, praised for his courage and feared for his harsh tactics. He spoke French and Occitan, likely understood Middle English, and spent most of his adult life in Aquitaine or on campaign, rather than in England. His reign as king, beginning in 1189, was marked by long absences as he joined the Third Crusade, raised enormous taxes to support his armies, and later defended his lands in Normandy against King Philip II of France. Richard's life remained centered around warfare even after his return from captivity under the Holy Roman Emperor, and by 1199 he was once again fighting in France. In March of that year, he moved into Limousin to suppress a revolt by Viscount Aymar V of Limoges, devastating the land despite the fact that it was Lent. During this campaign, he besieged the small and lightly defended castle of Chalus-Chabrol. On March 26, 1199, while Richard was on a leisurely walk inspecting the castle's defenses at close range alongside his mercenary captain Mercadier, a crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. At first, the injury appeared manageable. The siege continued, and the king even received some treatment. But the wound began to change rapidly. Infection set in, turning the damaged area black, a clear sign of gangrene. Without modern medicine, and with no possibility of amputation, Richard understood that death was approaching. As his condition worsened, he called for his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was then 75. She traveled from the nearby Fontevraud Abbey to be at his side. The wound continued to deteriorate over the following days. Chroniclers described Richard as feverish, weakened, and in significant pain. He died on April 6, 1199, at the age of 41, held by Eleanor as his final hours passed. His death shocked Europe. A king who had crossed continents, survived fierce battles, and endured imprisonment had been fatally wounded during a minor siege by what many later described as a lucky shot fired from the castle walls. After the castle fell, his men located the crossbowmen responsible. Sources offered conflicting accounts of the young man's name and age. Some chroniclers wrote that he claimed Richard had killed his father and brothers, and that the shot was an act of revenge. Richard reportedly forgave him shortly before dying. However, one chronicler claimed that Mercadier disregarded this final order and later dealt with the youth in a far harsher manner, driven more by loyalty and vengeance than by any sense of mercy. Following his death, Richard's body was disemboweled so it could be transported. His entrails were buried at Chalus. His heart was taken to Rouen Cathedral, honoring his long connection to Normandy. The rest of his body was placed at the feet of his father at Fontevraud Abbey. He left no legitimate heirs and was succeeded by his brother John. Richard's unexpected end, brought on by infection from a single wound, remains one of the Middle Ages' strangest deaths, a sharp contrast to the vast and violent life that preceded it.